So the last time we talked on Who Shot Ya, we talked about what is basically at the uh, similar point of every crime, which is motive. Most people need a reason to kill you,
Yeah.
unless they're psychopathic. And in the case of someone like Tupac or Biggie, uh, there was absolutely no one in their lives who was simply a killer.
Yeah. And psychopathic is its own motive.
Absolutely.
So, but yeah, that didn't happen for those guys.
So what we were offered in Tupac was the revenge motif.
Yeah.
Revenge.
Yeah, that's what they put up with the Orlando Anderson, what I call it the school play.
Yeah, what makes it so suspect is it was done in a place where it could not help but become evidence, a casino in Las Vegas.
Well, and what's also suspect about that are the videotapes that all get strewn together of everybody fleeing and all that stuff. It just seems like that's such a neat, contrived package. And that videotape comes to us through defense attorney David Kenner, who enters it into evidence in Shug's probation hearing.
So, could we say that the videotape, indeed and in fact, was a contrived motif or contrived motive for a revenge murder?
Yes, I would definitely say that the videotape is contrived to give us a place to look for this murder.
So, if the contrived motive is caught on film, we would have to be thinking about someone who is working in advance of an opportunity. I mean, the means are already known, but to work in advance of the means would be to create a motive. Who would know what street gang member would be thinking, oh, I know, let's create this motive by setting up a fight in a casino where there are thousands of cameras, and then when the means occurs, which is the trip to the nightclub, we'll murder. You know any gangbangers that think like that?
No, I don't know any gangbangers that think like that.
Who would you say?
Well, I would say that now we're talking about the higher powers,
Higher order.
higher order. And this is definitely something when you look at the actual murder that happens, Suge and Tupac are blocked in. There is nowhere for the driver to go when the Cadillac pulls up alongside. And so that's something that takes planning.
So if there's a motive other than revenge, and that motive calls for murder, there's an old slogan, an old saying, dead men tell no tales. So with the death of Tupac Shakur, who may have known of the impending motive, something that was either happening or something that could potentially happen, he couldn't tell us.
Well, he certainly couldn't tell us, even though he was expected to survive. And, it's come out recently. Yo Yo visited Tupac in the hospital and said, "Do you know who shot you?" And she felt like Tupac was trying to tell her that he did know who shot him, which may not have been a good thing for Tupac.
Well, that plus a bowl of ice cream, Mike.
Yeah,
When we look at crimes and we look at how they are solved, having been a mayor for 10 years and having worked with the police department, who was very efficient in solving murders, no matter who got caught, there has to be evidence that can be backed up by either witnesses or circumstances. They call that circumstantial evidence. If you don't have witnesses, you must have circumstance. So what do we have as a circumstance? The only other witness besides the killers that we really have is Suge.
Yeah. And Suge's so far not talking, although his attorney did say that he did talk when Russell Poole was alive, confirming that there was a gangbanger named Little Half Dead who was the shooter. But do we know for a fact that that's true? We heard it. I heard it through the attorney. I didn't hear it directly from Suge.
Well, if the motive is, as someone has said, uh, revenge for stolen music or something of that nature, that music would have to have great value. Second, even if you completed this murder, still doesn't mean you're going to be made whole. So I'm not buying that.
Well, I would just say too that there is a whole story that goes behind that, and that also includes a gang summit and permission and things coming from a higher order where that person was selected for a purpose.
Okay, that person may have been motivated because he felt that he had been done wrong.
Yeah.
But murder is an interesting thing. Once you commit it, you can never go back. I mean, you might rob a bank and you may pay restitution and pay that money back. You may kidnap someone and then you may let them go. But once you murder, you can't ever undo it.
Yeah.
So it's not something that I think most people enter into lightly if they're not enraged. This was not a murder of rage. If you can, obfuscate what you saw in the video, block that out, get that out your head, and look at the incident on the strip. Someone stepping up or driving up and pouring bullets into the car of a well-known celebrity in a place in Las Vegas where, yes, there are still video cameras, then that kind of speaks more to conspiracy.
Yeah.
Conspiracy about issues that might be well above ownership in an intellectual property. What do you think?
Well, I think when we talk about a higher order, if this was a higher order and it was orchestrated and the school play kind of tells us that, then we start looking at the higher order and saying, what would the motive be? It would be a much greater amount of money than just for one song or one record or, even one person. I mean, we had two people in the car. So you've got Death Row Records, which is worth $500 million. You also have Tupac Shakur, which never really made money while he was a recording artist. And he recorded some of the greatest tunes of all time.
Wasn't that the case with whatever label he was with? He didn't make money because he didn't do good deals. I'm thinking when we're talking motive, we may not be talking about the motivation of the person pulling the trigger.
Yeah. When we talk about the higher order, though, Tupac issued the one word that you can never say if a higher order has a design, and that was the word audit. And if Death Row Records was a nefarious company that was doing nefarious things, like putting out controlled substances on the streets, and all of a sudden there's going to be accountants and attorneys and court cases looking into those affairs in a very public way, that could be motive enough for both of them to go.
Yeah, but that kind of goes against the notion of common sense. If I'm going to have you audited, I'm not going to ride in the car with you, especially if I really believe you are Suge Knight. If I believe you're Suge Knight and you have the capacities that the character, not the person, Suge Knight has.
So let me ask you this. Let's say you went to court and you had a possession charge, and your attorney, in this case David Kenner, says, okay, he's going to perform community service at Club 662 on the night of the Tyson Seldon fight, and that is your punishment. Would you show up or would you stay away?
I might have showed up, but I certainly would not have taken a vehicle with a man that I threatened, or in the car with a man that I threatened with an audit, understanding who that man is. Now, what I try to do in my life, and I've had to do it for many, many years, I grew up in Compton. I grew up in the West Side Pyrus. I grew up with people that killed folk. I mean, and this was not a dream. I knew who the killers were, and I knew who the loud mobs were. And you deal with killers differently. If a person has a character that they're portraying themselves to be, and that character has access to people who can kill you, then once I threaten you with something that is very dangerous to you, I'm not getting in a car with you. I mean, because even the most simple individual who's looked at The Godfather knows you don't get in the car with people who don't want you to be healthy. Correct?
Correct.
So obviously, Suge and Tupac had enough trust in one another that they could at least ride together. Now we're talking real life. I mean, you know, I grew up in the hood, and there were certain people I wouldn't ride with. Not because I was afraid that they would do something to me, but because I was fully aware that this guy will do something to other people, and provocation can be minimal. And I'm not going to speak of this guy, but he probably became a victim to death row, and he was no joke. And because he was no joke, people knew you couldn't get in the car with him. Don't meet him for dinner. Don't come by his house. I just want to talk. No, that's not what you do with this guy. Okay, so if Tupac had threatened Suge with an audit, and he believed in the myth of Suge Knight, he wouldn't get in the car with him. No.
Or go to the fight with him.
Absolutely not. So throw that out of your mind. These two guys got hit, and they had no idea they were about to be hit. And the only way that happens is if the hit is well planned and well thought out.
Yeah. The big question was Tupac going to still come to Vegas? And that was a question from the 4th all the way through the 7th, whether or not he was going to show up in Las Vegas.
Well, if he doesn't show up in Vegas, that murder doesn't happen.
Yeah.
He might have been killed later on, but he would not have been killed under the provisions and the scenarios that were necessary to make this murder look like it was gangbanging.
Yeah. There were an awful lot of preparations that were made, including an LAPD cop that was there from 2 days before the actual shooting until 2 days after Tupac dies. And he's on special assignment.
Well, here's what you got to know. Whenever you say LAPD, you and I have a point of demarcation. I'm black. I live in an area where the LAPD frequents. And they don't really need too much of a motive. And they certainly don't need a whole bunch of evidence to prove the contrary, that I presented a threat to them and they wanted to kill me, and they did. And they can find, believe me, 12 black jurors and one good judge to get whoever does it off. So you have to be careful when you say LAPD, because that's just, to me, like saying the Crips.
Yeah.
Or the bounty hunters. Because if you're true to these streets and you understand what goes on out here, you know that a black man's life is about as valuable in the hands of the LAPD as a cockroach. And I wish we lived in a world where Colin Kaepernick did not have to take a knee during the national anthem. I wish we lived in the world of Perry Mason. But not only did that world not exist when Perry Mason was being shot and filmed, it doesn't exist now. Black people are routinely killed by the police. And they get away with it. Black people are routinely convicted by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office with no evidence. Because there is a perception in the world that if you're black, you did something. And so we're struggling with all of these multifarious levels of states of consciousness, whereas all we have to do is stage a fight in a hotel and have a young group of black men fighting each other, and that led to a death. And yeah, bing, there it is.
Well, and a death in front of hundreds of witnesses, and it's still unsolved. And the same with Biggie. And really, before I got involved in these cases, I would have probably disagreed with you and said, oh no, racism's over, it doesn't exist. But having delved into these cases now, I've become a big believer that we have a long way to go before black men like yourselves can get a fair trial or can even get a fair judgment call from a cop.
Let's be clear. Racism is a tool.
Yeah.
Racism is a tool of the rich to affect certain outcomes against the poor. The problem is that most poor white people and most poor black people don't know that racism is a tool. And if you try to explain this to people, oh, racism is a tool. Yeah, how so? Yeah, well, I can get white folk to hate black folks, and if that's the case, I can isolate a black person who is an enemy against what I'm trying to do as a higher power capitalist individual. And I can get both the racist whites and the poor blacks to believe in whatever story I tell to vilify this individual. And in this particular case, where we're talking about Tupac Shakur, a person that sold more records than anyone in the time that he was a recording artist. Just the mere fact that it's been 20 some odd years and there's been no movement on his murder is obscene. Had this been a white star, the outcry for someone to be arrested and someone to be prosecuted would be so great that the police would have no choice. Even if they picked the wrong guy, they'd pick someone.
Yeah.
But in this particular case, the mere fact that no one has been prosecuted and no one has been arrested suggests that A, racism on a base level is at play, and more importantly, that there may be higher order operatives who are involved in this that are engaging in the process of keeping the killer unknown. Now let's go back and think. Where did Suge Knight come from? Where did the Mob Piru come from? Where did the West Side Pirus come from?
Compton.
And what else came out of Compton? Oliver North and the United States government chose to use Compton as a way station for importing and distributing drugs across America to pay for a war. Now, that right there, the mere fact that our government has confessed to that, means that anything goes. If you would take your own citizens and a black community and make it stage one for your planning to finance a secret war for clandestine goals and saturate an entire race of people with drugs and the violence that comes along with drug turf and territory, then you cannot discount the fact that potentially government actors are involved in the killing of Tupac Shakur.
Well, and let's even go back to how did Tupac Shakur become famous? I mean, you had President Bush and Vice President Dan Quayle and Vice President Dan Quayle, who's implicated in those Oliver North activities, is the one that made Tupac Shakur famous. And so, if you have a willing record label, and you have a person that you think could bring in lots of money, why not call him out and say there's no place for this man in our society? Which is exactly what Oliver North did, or not Oliver North, but Dan Quayle did. He called out Tupac Shakur and said there's no place for you in our society, and immediately Tupac Shakur overnight became famous, and he started bringing in huge revenue that he never saw in his own bank account.
Well, isn't that a suspicious story?
That's a very suspicious story.
Someone becomes an enemy of the state, and the state uses propaganda that in fact makes this individual probably way more important than he should be for the purpose of annihilating him. And other nefarious things that have to go on in a clandestine manner, and they have to be covered by the obvious. You know, I lived through that era. I saw Compton go from a middle income, family oriented, African American enclave to a nightmare. And the Crips weren't born in Compton. I mean, this didn't start here. It was almost like they had a global tracking device to find their way to Compton. And once they got here, Compton has always had a tradition of fighting outsiders. And thus, a street with less than 50 homes on it, Piru, becomes a national and international factor in the world because these guys are going to fight back. They don't care what the odds are. So, yeah, that sounds like a story that repeats itself. But let's talk about what might be a more deeply seated motive. What if my real agenda is population control, population management? What if after the 65 riots, I'm looking for an opportunity to disband African American communities wherever there has been tension between that community and the police? Well, that kind of explains what's going on in Chicago right now, correct?
Absolutely.
And it would definitely explain what happened to the African American population, totally displaced. And in fact, and indeed, if you were to take away the immigrant Latino population from South Central Los Angeles, it would be a ghost town. If you would take them away from Compton, it would be a ghost town. And somebody would say, where did 100,000 black people in Compton go? They just vanished.
They went to prison or they got killed.
Absolutely. Or those who could moved.
Yeah. And I think obviously that's the motive of bringing crack cocaine. I mean, when you think of crack cocaine, who was the first person that mixed that stuff?
I don't know. I wasn't there.
But my point is,
I'm just
kidding.
kidding.
No, exactly. But my point is, that somebody had to teach somebody how to actually make that stuff.
Well, there are plenty of scientists that have PhDs in chemical engineering rolling around Compton and Watts and Willowbrook and North Long Beach, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I mean, of course, they knew how to create an accelerant and turn it into a super accelerant, right?
Once somebody showed them how to do it.
You see?
Yeah.
So, when you're looking at Tupac's murder and his death, it's a multifold look because, yes, he did have some political leanings and he did have some pseudo-militant ideologies. I would never, and I don't care who says what, I would never put Tupac on the level of Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey or Martin Luther King. And I'm sorry if you're younger than I am and you don't understand why. That's your problem, not mine. Because those men's agenda was changing the way we live. That was not Tupac's agenda. So I don't place him there. But based upon what was in existence in terms of African American leadership and who had what impact, besides maybe Louis Farrakhan at the time, Tupac might have been number two. And certainly there could have been a motivation to silence his voice because as we get older and we become more mature, we tend to, get rid of the sexually nuanced ideologies that we have. We get rid of the violence and we start focusing on, real answers to real problems. And perhaps there was a fear of that. But that part of the government wouldn't be this sloppy. I mean, if this is a higher order thing, the part of the government that deals with silencing political figures would not have killed Tupac in that way. It would have been far more subtle, far more covert.
And this was definitely sloppy. I mean, what you have at the end, Suge's not dead, Tupac's not dead. And in fact, both of them are expected to survive. Suge does survive. Tupac maybe was murdered in the hospital. We don't know.
Well, then if it's not the big boys and it's not these street goons, then who was it?
Well, and you look at what happens in the aftermath and who ends up running Death Row Records. It certainly wasn't Suge running it from jail or prison.
Well, some people might argue with that. I'll give that to you. But playing the devil's advocate, if what you are suggesting took place, and if that was the model, the rubric for what would happen after the murder, then there would have had to been tremendous payoffs in Las Vegas, tremendous payoffs in Compton, in both the DA's office, in the office of the chief of police, or at least investigative offices of places that you would hope would never become compromised. And so if you can find evidence that these offices were compromised, then that would lead to, even though it's higher order operational skills, it's not as high as the federal government, but far above the streets.
And I think that leads us right to where, it makes sense. The LAPD officer he was there with two accomplices. That's all part of the FBI redacted documents. We don't know the names of the other two, but Officer Kevin Gaines is dating Sharitha Knight at the time, and he's the one that's on special assignment in Las Vegas. And it's folklore, but evidently Kevin Hackey said that it's true, that Kevin Gaines and Sharitha were taken to a hole in the desert where they were made to strip naked, and then they were abandoned, and they had to find their way back from the desert to society. That might also make you pretty upset. And that happened a few months before this murder.
Yeah, but for someone who comes from Compton and someone who knows how this game is played, no one who is from Compton and really a killer is going to take you somewhere to kill you and then let you go. This sounds like more movie acting. This sounds like more drama. This sounds like I'm bad and you better believe me. Because if you run into somebody who's bad from Compton, you don't have to find reasons to believe them. They're going to give you the reasons. And they're not going to be fake. They're not going to be things to make you think, as Arsenio used to say, things that make you go, They're going to put a bullet in you. Anyone from this community that's in the life who digs a hole and takes you to it is going to leave you in it. Second, nobody's digging holes in the desert anymore, right? They just shoot you. They ride up to you on your motorcycle, 4 cars, and they bust caps on you until you are lifeless.
And it usually doesn't take much.
It doesn't. All I need to know is where you're going, where you're leaving from, and what time. So, you know, I would say whoever did this, and I'm not talking about the person that pulled the trigger, I'm talking about the person that had the capacity to put the plan together and ultimately was motivated by something that either stood to happen if it did not happen or stood to happen if it did happen. Got it?
Got it.
That person is your killer. And that person is not a street level individual.
So one of the pieces of evidence that's come out that's pretty interesting is the head of security for death row was standing next to Michael Moore, who was Tupac's bodyguard, and because he refused to disarm, and all the bodyguards were disarmed that night, because he refused to disarm, this individual had him next to him because he wanted to know where that gun was at all times. This individual, Michael Moore, also was paramedic trained. Probably would have been a bad person to have at the scene of a murder. Somebody that could actually save the life. So they wanted to be close. They're over the radio at the time Tupac and Suge were shot. He hears, "Got him," come over the radio. And then he hears a white voice come over that says, "Don't say nothing over the radio." And then the head of security shuts down all of the radios. He gets on the radio and says, "Everybody that's on a radio, turn them off."
Let me tell you, that's interesting. And I've heard it before. If you're a street level operator, you ask basic questions. I said in our last interview that if someone gets shot in a Piru neighborhood, the Pirus have guys that are smart enough to go out, look at the evidence, and come back with a conclusion, take it to a shot caller, and then say, more than likely, this is the perpetrator. Crips have the same thing. You know, I know more Crips than I know Pirus. Oftentimes, I'm in Crip neighborhoods and I'm beloved because I treat them like men. They treat me like men. We have an understanding and we care about each other. Or they're fooling me, and I don't believe they are. I think they really like me, and I do like them because I grew up with them, played baseball with them, played football with them. You know, they just happen to live in Crip neighborhoods, but I have personal relationships with them, and many of them operate just like Pirus, and we all know this. I mean, this is not a myth. You know, we know how to get to the bottom of who shot John, right? So the simplest question is, what got breached that night? And the answer is security.
Yeah, if you were running security that night, you immediately should have been fired.
What got breached? Security.
Yeah.
How did security get breached? Did it get breached because they were unarmed? No. That was a symptom that made accessibility to the target much easier. Did it get breached because they thought they were safe? No. You're never safe after one of those fights. If you're a celebrity and you're moving through Las Vegas, so you should have been on guard all the time. What got breached? When you answer what got breached and find out who was in charge of that element of the security, you find your killer.
Well, so you had a caravan of cars, and typical Mossad style hit, the two cars that are in front that are the pace vehicles blocking in Suge and Tupac are, one of them is the whisperer that whispered into Tupac's ear and got him to go attack Orlando Anderson. And the other one is close to the alleged shooter from the Cadillac, according to the confession letter. And so that's kind of an interesting thing because those are the pace vehicles. Those are the ones that are going to control the tempo. And then, of course, you have the other vehicles that are surrounding. But Suge, who never let anybody be in front of him, somehow gets boxed in.
Let me ask a question. Why wasn't there security in the car with Tupac and Suge?
I mean, that's a great question. Frank Alexander, who was the only security guard that was in the caravan, was asked to drive the car Tupac was driving with the
Okay,
outlaws. And so he, instead of being security and he had been disarmed, he's now driving a different vehicle behind them.
when you're in a car and you're being shot at, there's only two things that can save you. You shoot back,
Or you go
or you get in a position via your vehicle
to
to
escape.
either escape or ram the perpetrator. Okay?
Yeah.
Because cars are weapons.
Yeah.
Please understand this. If you've ever been living in a community like Inglewood or Compton and somebody's shooting at you and you kind of understand the streets, your car is your weapon.
And as we know from Suge at Tams,
Absolutely.
car is a weapon.
I mean, yes, once the event takes place and you are engaging an assailant, if you don't have a gun, your weapon is your car, correct?
Correct.
So if you look at the car, you'll see that that car was struck. And it was struck in several places, and I'm not talking about bullets. Secondly, if you look at Suge's behavior on multiple occasions, you'll see he understood that a car is a weapon for either fight or flight, right?
Yeah.
But if you're totally taken off guard, even if you're aware of this, you may not be able to create a scenario where you can use your car to flee or fight. And that is what I'm thinking happened that night. And that is what I'm thinking leads us to where is the breach in security and who's responsible for that. See, I don't like to cast aspersions on organizations like the LAPD. First of all, it's dangerous. Secondly, you may color good people with a nasty brush. But look at the specificity of the events and rule out things that just simply don't make any sense and begin to hone on to things that actually occurred. What we know for a fact occurred is there was a breach of security on that street where the shooting took place, and Suge could not escape the breach. Now, why couldn't he escape? That's important.
Yeah. Blocked in, 6 barricades.
So therefore, who knew the route?
The head of security knew the route, and probably a number of the people that were in the death row camp.
So if you know who knew the route, then you would know who gave the route to the killers. And you see, that's when I say it doesn't matter who pulled the trigger. The person who put the plan together is probably most culpable and probably most endowed with a motive. Because conspiracy to commit murder is death.
Yeah. And there's no statute of limitations.
It's special circumstances right off the top. So who's that guy? Well, let me tell you, that guy had to feel as though he was untouchable. Because if this goes wrong, there's literally hell to pay. And I'm not talking about hell in a cell. I'm talking about you're going to meet your maker's adversary as soon as your last appeal runs out.
Yeah. Yeah. If you live that long.
If you live. So I think that when you focus on the murder of Tupac and you focus on the murder of Biggie, you're talking about people who believe they can operate with immunity in broad daylight. People who will kill on the Sunset Strip. People who will kill on the Las Vegas Strip. People who will kill in the most populous areas because they have a level of cover. Now, you either had that cover going in, which would make you a government operative of a high order, or you bought it.
Makes perfect sense.
And I think we should end our segment right
I
there.
think we should too. This has been Who Shot Ya? And we're here with former Mayor Omar Bradley. And look for us on another edition of Who Shot Ya?
Bang. You're dead.